What happened at the bottom of this deep pit is almost too awful to believe. It became a mass grave for thousands of innocent people of many nationalities. The pit is massive, about 6 meters deep and 25 meters wide. It was built as an oil storage facility by the Soviet government, but the project was never finished. 7 of these pits are located in the Ponary forest in Lithuania, only about 10 kilometers from the capital city of Vilnius. In the early 1900s, this place was quite a popular spot for family vacations, strolls and picnics. However, in the summer of 1941, it became a site of mass executions. Victims included Lithuanian anti-fascists, communist sympathizers, the local Jewish population, Soviet POWs, Polish partisans, and even Polish clergy. The executioners were German SS men, auxiliary policemen, and Lithuanian volunteers. The estimated number of victims is 100,000 people, an unbelievably high number. Thousands upon thousands of personal tragedies. I found 4 of them in the Black Book. Please, listen closely. It was July 1941 in occupied Lithuania. Although a certain part of the population may have welcomed the Germans as liberators from the Soviet regime, paying no attention to what was happening to their Jewish neighbors, I want to believe that most Lithuanians were in shock from what the so-called German humanism brought with itself to this beautiful Baltic land: death and suffering. All Jewish men from the age of 16 to 60 had to work for the German, seemingly unstoppable war machine. Motlgdud and his father were also among them. They worked at the airfield in Purbanek, now known as Vilnius International Airport. Purbanek used to be the name of the neighboring village, which is now part of the capital. For all that hard labor, the men received a special document that forbade any Lithuanian fascists from detaining them, but not the Germans, I suppose. Once when Motl was coming back home with his friend after a day of hard, never-ending labor, they were stopped by 3 German officers. They were ordered to get into a truck with 6 other Jewish men and driven to the Bernardinsky Sad, where they spent the night. In the morning, Motl and 34 other men were forced into a black truck and taken to the Ponary forest to be killed. What followed was almost like some sick ritual, to say the least. The truck suddenly stopped and a German officer approached the door. Whoever he pointed at had to come down. Motl was the 7th. Through the door, he could see his acquaintances being executed, one by one. He must have been in shock. At a ditch leading to a huge pit, people were forced to undress. Then the officer led each naked man into the pit and shot him in the back of the head. Now it was Motl's turn. As he approached the pit, completely naked, he could hear the cries of people still alive but dying in agony at the bottom. Then a loud gunshot rang out. He thought he was dead, killed, but luckily the bullet did not hit him. He must have fallen just a second before the gunshot. Motl lay unconscious, alive among the dead bodies of his friends until the morning sun woke him up. The execution was still going on. Just in case, the executioners machine gunned the grave filled with dead bodies. Motl was lightly wounded. Then all went silent. The executioners, dressed in uniforms and some even just in civilian clothes, sat down and began drinking vodka. Drunk, they eventually left the place. Motl, still completely naked and now also wounded, crawled out of the grave and managed to escape from that awful place. An unknown Polish man welcomed him into his home, treated his wound, and gave him clothes. When Motl told his father all he had seen in Ponary, he did not believe him. It happened on October 24th, 1941. The Germans broke into the house of Kiana Katz and her family. When she asked them if she should take anything with her, they suggested that gold might be a useful thing to have at their new destination. On that day, the Katz family and all the Jewish inhabitants of the house were taken to Lukishka's prison in Vilnius. There, they were ordered to strip down to their underwear and were beaten with metal clubs. Why? I have no idea. In the morning, the children and men were separated from the women, who were then forced into a truck and driven away. Inside the truck, a German officer, allegedly named Weiss, said, "You know, I am now your father. I'm taking you to a factory to work. What kind of work? Soon you will find out." Then he gave every single woman a cookie. Sick. When they arrived at Ponary, the women were driven into a ditch with whips. The girls had to strip naked and wait to be executed. The warning was clear. Eyes of those who wouldn't listen would be gouged out. Hina saw with her own eyes how they killed her father. Bloody, he fell onto a heap of dead bodies. At the end of the day, it was Kiana's turn to be killed. In groups of 10, they led the women to a massive pit, 30 to 40 meters wide. They were all blindfolded. Kiana remembers stepping on dead but still warm bodies. Then the gunshot rang out. Kiana's sister shouted God and fell. Kiana also fell to the ground and lost consciousness. At dawn, she woke up, lying buried under a mass of dead bodies. She somehow managed to crawl out and made her way to the ghetto. She had nowhere else to go. All her family was dead, lying at the bottom of that pit in the Ponary forest. In April 1943, Germans killed around 4,000 Jews at the Ponary execution site. One day after this quote-unquote Aktion, on April 6th, a German officer came into the ghetto and selected 10 Jewish men to go and bury the dead. Solomon Garbel was among them. Already half a kilometer from Ponary, the field was covered with dead bodies. The victims had tried to escape. They fought for their lives to the last breath. The grass was soaked in blood of innocent people, men and women, young and old. Near the trees, you could find lifeless bodies of little boys and girls, some brutally in half by some evil humans. Solomon even saw a mound of children's heads. It must have felt like a literal hell on earth. I can't even imagine the pain. The officer gave the shocked men some vodka and told them to start working, bury all the dead. All of them. Like I said, it was hell. Solomon and his colleagues buried around 500 people in total. Convinced they would be shot at the end of the day, they were pleasantly surprised when they were allowed to return to the ghetto. I have actually no idea if you can be pleasantly surprised in such a situation. As they were leaving, the mass graves began to move. The bodies started to swell, lifting the earth above them. In September 1943, the Germans began to exhume and burn the corpses from all the massive graves in the Ponary forest. This inhumane task was to be done by approximately 80 men, who themselves were to be executed and burned afterward. The group consisted of 70 Jewish men, 9 Russian POWs, and 1 young Pole from the village of Leshnik, who had been arrested for hiding a little Jewish girl named Liepaja. Isaac Dugim was one of the 80 men chosen for this horrific task. When not working, the men were confined in a dark pit, 20 meters wide and 4 meters deep. And not only that, they were in shackles at all times. In shackles. They burned 56,800 corpses in total, which was just half of all the people executed in Ponary. Isaac quite well remembers the opening of the first mass grave. Most of the victims were young men with their hands bound behind their backs and blindfolded. The grave contained 10,000 corpses, including 500 Soviet POWs and several clergymen. The deceased were laid in rows. In another grave, the men found bodies of children with no visible blood wounds. Judging by protruding tongues, they all must have been buried alive. During the exhumation, Isaac found his own murdered family, and he wasn't the only one. All 80 men knew very well that once their work was done, they too would be executed and burned. The only possible way out was to dig a tunnel from the pit where they were confined at night, and that's exactly what they decided to do. Every single night, they dug the tunnel using only spoons. On April 15th, 1944, at 4 a.m., they finally decided to try their luck and escape from the Ponary hell. Isaac Dugim went first into the tunnel. One by one, they crawled out of the earth and began to make their way out of Ponary. All the men were barefoot to avoid making any noise. However, someone stepped on a twig, and a guard began to fire his machine gun into the night. Most of the men were killed, but 13 survived and ran into the forest. Solomon was among those lucky ones. 11 men joined the partisans, and 2 managed to cross the front lines.